Good afternoon. Some years ago I made a video about the worst allocation of rolling stock in Britain. It did pretty well and almost 100,000 people have watched it, so why don't we check in on my suggestions? Well, East Midlands Railway is giving their Class 360s the refurbishment I asked for. Great Northern has indeed taken on the Class 379s and is running them on the London to Cambridge services. And GWR have scaled back turbo operation on Portsmouth to Cardiff trains, and craziest of all, are requiring the Class 175s. They're not putting them on the same route that I said, but this is still a pretty good record. Of course, there's absolutely no chance that it was my video that made any of these things happen. The railway takes quite a while to get things done, and these plans were probably being drawn up well before I even thought of the video. Furthermore, these were also pretty obvious suggestions. Most had already been discussed in railway circles anyway, I wasn't exactly breaking new ground. But still, it's pretty fun that these things have happened, so I thought I'd give it another go. Let's start off with an old friend, East Midlands Railway. Specifically, their Norwich to Liverpool Lime Street services. This is one of those mammoth regional routes that threads together several of Britain's largest cities and several of Britain's busiest main lines. It starts in the centre of Liverpool, then picks passengers up at the airport before crossing the West Coast Main Line at Warrington. It then makes its way along the painstakingly busy Castlefield corridor into Manchester, boarding at a torture chamber, Manchester Piccadilly Platform 13, and carrying on to the other huge city of Sheffield, where it joins the Midland Main Line and races down to Nottingham. This would already be a pretty long route, but it's not over yet. It then makes a vital link over to the East Coast Main Line, before running along it to Peterborough, and then crossing the delightfully flat fens to finally reach the fine city of Norwich 5 hours and 24 minutes after leaving Liverpool. Yet despite this gargantuan length, which provides very important connections, the trains used are Class 158s. They run as 4-car units between Liverpool and Nottingham, but only 2 carry on to Norwich, with predictable consequences. The service is uncomfortably crowded across pretty much the whole route, and as much as I love Class 158s, they're really not good at handling crowds. Their air conditioning struggles at the best of times, and being crushed into a boiling vestibule with a dozen other passengers isn't exactly a pleasant experience. Even if they did have enough capacity though, they're just not appropriate for this job. It sort of goes without saying, but being only 2-car units, they don't have a buffet, they're standard class throughout, and generally lack many of the amenities you expect from a long-distance train. Now, of course, not many people are actually going the whole way between Liverpool and Norwich, but this isn't exactly a local stopper either. A significant proportion of the route's passengers are travelling a reasonable distance, and without doubt, many more would if the experience was a bit more pleasant. Performance-wise too, the 158s are really not up to much. They have a maximum speed of just 90 miles an hour, and their engines are so underpowered that it takes them ages to reach that. Now, the route in the main isn't that fast, so the top speed isn't much of a worry, but there are several sections where it's running along busy, high-speed main lines, and an extra bit of gusto would be appreciated. But it's the acceleration that's the real problem. If trains are able to pull away from stations quicker, they could knock quite a lot off the journey time, and indeed free up room for more trains. The 158s are also just pretty old, and despite many refurbishments, they're probably in need of replacement anyway. So, what should replace them? Well, there are 2 possible futures for this route. It either leans more into the regional side of things and is split at Nottingham, as almost happened a few years ago, or it moves from the EMR Regional to EMR Intercity brand, and becomes a route much more oriented around the longer distance passenger. This might be controversial, but I very strongly believe it should go to the latter. We shouldn't have to let important intercity connections sort of sit there in stagnant misery just because they don't serve London. There are also practical reasons for this choice too. EMR Regional is facing a pretty severe shortage of trains, such that overcrowding is extremely common. Moving resources from other regional routes to this is just rearranging deck chairs and will probably only serve to strangle growth on local lines. EMR Intercity though is receiving a large new fleet of Hitachi Class 810s. These aren't perfect trains by any means, but they do look like they'll be decent intercity stock. Apart from in one very important regard. Capacity. They're all 5 coaches. Now yes, for a 5-coach train they pack a lot of punch. They actually have more standard class seats than a 7-car Class 222, which they're replacing, and EMR have promised that they'll run some trains in pairs. But frankly, I just don't think it's going to be enough. Especially after the Midland Main Line's electrification, I can see the potential demand for up to 10-coach trains on most services. and at that point you might as well just get longer units. So, in that spirit, let's say 20 out of the 33 units should be lengthened to 9 coaches. This would significantly reduce the number of trains required, as you wouldn't have to run as many pairs, and some of the spare 5 cars could run, you guessed it, Liverpool to Norwich. This would significantly improve both the route's performance and its passenger experience. The introduction of first class would also be a great way for the railway to get a little bit of extra revenue, and I reckon you'd get reasonable loadings on a journey like this, provided the first class service was good, of course. Furthermore, the bi-mode capabilities of the Class 810s would enable them to run on electric power where the route is electrified, saving fuel costs, reducing engine wear, and limiting carbon emissions. However, this isn't a perfect solution. A 5-car 810 actually has fewer standard class seats than a 4-car 158, and whilst the presence of first class will probably take the edge off overcrowding, it doesn't really encourage much growth. Apart from, of course, beyond Nottingham, where trains are currently only 2 cars. Now, sure, you could lengthen these 810s too, to maybe 7 coaches, but at this point I wonder if it's best to just go for an entirely new fleet. Britain doesn't really seem to have a good sort of second-tier intercity train at the moment. Something like the Class 397 maybe. A train that's fast and pretty comfortable, but not exactly the creme de la creme of high-speed technology. Even still though, there's only so much capacity you can squeeze out of a 5-car train. We have to acknowledge that if we want to see considerable growth on this route, which I hope we do, we have to invest in either much longer trains or more frequent service. At the moment, short platforms and congested lines make this feel pretty unlikely, but to get real gains, we have to bite the bullet. Next up, another familiar operator, Great Western Railway, on their London to Oxford services. Now, travel between London and Oxford is so important for tourism, and indeed the government's economic plans, that you'd expect it to be a flagship example of British transport at its best. But it very much is not. Usually, when I complain about allocation, I do so because a train is woefully underspecified for a service. However, it's sort of the opposite here. GWR use Class 800 IETs to run the short services between London and Oxford. Crazy, seeing as these are supposed to be long-distance intercity trains. In fact, GWR's long-haul services have a huge shortage of IETs, such that many several-hour-long journeys are being operated by just 5 coaches. All the while, units with full-size kitchens taking up half a coach are being wasted on this 50-minute driver-only hop. It's not even like they provide a good service either. The IETs are uncomfortable, and in what's becoming a recurring trend, the 5 coaches these services normally have are often very overloaded. It gives a really terrible impression of this country to visitors. So why is it like this? Well, the branch to Oxford was going to be electrified, until 2016 when the government cancelled it. This also included the much needed remodelling of Oxford railway station, which is currently completely inadequate for the passenger volumes it gets. But of course, by the time they cancelled it, a large fleet of electric trains had already been bought, the Class 387s. As a result, there were more of them than anyone really knew what to do with for a while. This is to say nothing of the many relatively new electric fleets that are sitting around with absolutely no use at all. Nonetheless, the lack of electrification requires bi-mode trains like the 800s to be used. No prizes for guessing what I'm going to say then. We need to electrify the line to Oxford. It's only 10 miles, and given how basically all hopes of increasing frequency and capacity to Oxford depend on it, it is frankly stupid that the electrification hasn't been revived. Even more so considering the government's recent push for an Oxford to Cambridge arc. Failing to even mention something so important makes a mockery of these ambitions. After electrification, Oxford trains would of course be run by Class 387s, freeing up 800s for intercity work elsewhere. But hold on a minute. GWR runs 2 trains an hour between London and Oxford, but only one terminates there. The other continues along the Cotswold line to Worcester, Malvern or Hereford. Now, you could electrify this line of course, but that's probably something for the future. In the meantime, it'll have to continue using IETs, and I stand by my suggestions in my video on improving those trains. This should be refurbished, and most of the 5 cars should be lengthened to 9 cars, removing the need for 10-car operation, with the exception of trains on the Cotswold line. A pair of 5 cars would run together to Oxford before splitting, with the leading train running fast to Worcester and beyond, and the trailing set stopping at all the little Cotswold stations, before terminating at Moreton and Marsh. So, if all these changes were to be implemented, we'd end up with 3 trains an hour to Oxford, up from 2. Journey times would be noticeably quicker, and each train would have at least 8 coaches. Running costs on the Cotswold line would definitely increase, as you'd be almost doubling the number of trains. But using lower spec, purely electric traction on the Oxford shorts would save considerable amounts of money. Passenger growth too would likely pay back for a lot of these investments, which from an infrastructure perspective would only involve 10 miles of electrification and the Oxford station remodelling, which should happen anyway. But the best argument for it is that this is just necessary if you want to see any growth in Oxford. The trains can't cope as is, so the government is deluding itself if it thinks it can create Europe's Silicon Valley without doing anything to this service. Okay, finally, I feel duty-bound to mention cross-country in one of these videos, and whilst almost all cross-country routes could qualify, I think Cardiff to Nottingham really takes the biscuit. This is a 3.5-hour journey, linking the capital of Wales and Britain's second city, with many other sizable towns and cities along the way. Yet it's almost exclusively operated by 3-coach Class 170 DMUs. As with the 158s, I like the 170s, but they're not really suitable for this journey. The legroom is non-existent, the interiors are getting extremely worn by now, and their doors are positioned at 1/3 and 2/3 intervals instead of at the end of the coach. This leaves you with engine noise and drafts blowing right through the main cabin, wasting energy on heating and making the passenger experience a little unpleasant. Of course, 1/3, 2/3 doors do have their benefits. They allow for faster boarding, reducing station dwell times, something that's particularly important for a service that stops regularly. And to be honest, the Cardiff to Nottingham trains do sort of fall into this category. The intervals between stations are about 10 to 20 minutes. There is a reasonable argument to be made that 1/3, 2/3 doors are acceptable here, but I wouldn't make it. This is currently the only link between Cardiff and Birmingham and Nottingham too, so whilst the local journeys it provides are important, it clearly should lean towards a more intercity style of operation. It's not even like the 170s are particularly good at stop-start anyway, they've got pretty awful acceleration. Once again though, the main thing is capacity. Predictably, 3 coaches is nowhere near enough for such an important journey, and the trains are uncomfortably overcrowded. So what can be done? Well, I think this route should be incorporated into cross-country's broader, proper intercity network, and be operated by voyagers or whatever replaces them. Obviously, cross-country doesn't have enough voyagers to permit this as is, but rather conveniently, a lot have just come off lease from Avanti West Coast who've recently replaced them, and EMR's Class 222s, which are functionally identical to voyagers, will be freed up soon as well. You'd need to run 5-car voyages to provide any meaningful capacity increase, but once you've done that, you'll be looking at a significant improvement in the passenger experience. However, the voyages aren't exactly cheap. 750 horsepower per coach is a lot, and it's definitely overkill south of Birmingham where the line speed doesn't top 100 miles an hour. As with Liverpool to Norwich, we're brought back to this idea that we're missing a certain category of train, something that's fast and comfortable but not overbuilt. If we're talking about longer term solutions though, then we need to go beyond just rolling stock. The real problem with Cardiff to Nottingham also affects every other service leaving Birmingham for the southwest. It's the bottleneck of the cross-city line. Between Birmingham New Street and Kings Norton, there's a section of double-track line that is used by basically every type of service you can imagine. Commuter trains run every 15 minutes, stopping at all the little stations along the way, holding up traffic. There are 2 cross-country expresses every hour, the Cardiff to Nottingham train and then a Hereford service. And this is only the off-peak. Frequencies can't really be increased, as they should, if you're not going to do anything about this. Thus, there have been many ideas that would help. One is the Midlands Rail Hub. This would be an expansion of Birmingham Moor Street Station, permitting it to take many of the services that currently come into New Street and allowing them to run on the somewhat less congested Camp Hill line, avoiding the cross-city. But this doesn't solve all the problems, and in any case, funding hasn't exactly been forthcoming, and the new government has gone pretty quiet on it. So what could be done to improve capacity between Birmingham and Cardiff in the short term? Well, why not extend the Birmingham to Hereford trains to run through to Cardiff? Even at current line speeds, which are pretty low, it would still be only 20 minutes slower than the existing route, and it's about the same distance anyway. If you were to increase the speed limit at a few locations, notably between Droitwich and Malvern and Ledbury and Hereford, you could get performance that's pretty similar to the existing cross-country line, and for very trivial sums. After all, the sections I've highlighted are straight enough for speeds that are far higher than the ones I actually see. Indeed, much of it actually had a speed limit of 90 miles an hour until it was reduced to 70 in the 1970s. Providing they don't break down, of course, West Midlands Railway actually has a considerable surplus of Class 196 DMUs, so it wouldn't be that difficult for them to extend the Hereford services all the way to Cardiff. The only real problem I can see is that of platform space at Cardiff Central, but that's a topic for its own video. I could be missing something obvious, of course, but this does look like a relatively easy and cheap way to improve this vital transport link. Well, there we are. We've spent a bit more time talking about infrastructure than I would have liked, but I think this serves to illustrate a pretty important point. A lot of the low-hanging fruit has actually been picked. To really improve service, we do have to do some investment. This isn't throwing money around. By all means, make sure the investment is strategic and well-targeted. But given what's happening in other parts of the world, it's crucial that we reiterate that infrastructure spending is not a bad thing. All our other ambitions, whatever they may be, depend upon it. And if the government doesn't realise that, then we won't be going anywhere. Literally.